The Swedish pathologist writes that these bruises were barely visible. What does that tell you?
That tells me that the amount of force that was exerted in these areas was really relatively minimal. That is about really what one would see it by picking up a body, whether someone who is barely alive or someone who is dead, just picking them up by the arms and transferring the body. And it tells me that the force is very minimal and the amount of bleeding thus is very, very minimal. So it's much, much less than what would be expected as compared with injuries from a true struggle.
The autopsy was not made until 2 days later. How could that have affected the color of the bruises and the bruises themselves?
It's very, very well known that bruises or small hemorrhages or small areas of bleeding underneath the skin will rise to the surface over the course of a couple of days, say 2 days after the person died. And in fact, that is actually a technique that is used sometimes severely, and we will actually keep the child's body for a day or 2 days or even 3 days and look at the body each day to see if there are bruises that come to the surface that we couldn't see earlier. So pathologists know that this is a finding that can be created. That is, the bruises will come to the surface over the course of a few days inside a cooler. So this finding that she's describing of pale or light blue small discolorations or bruises is very typical of what would be seen in a body that's refrigerated, and also means that probably those minor injuries were not apparent at the time when she died. And for the fact that I discussed earlier of her being an alcoholic and more prone to easier bruising, all of that together would make me conclude that much more probably these findings on her arms are simply the effect of her being dead and the body being moved several times.
But the Swedish pathologist says that a dead body can't get bruises.
That really is not accurate. If you define a bruise as an area of bleeding in the skin or under the skin in a living person, then that's true. But a bruise simply is an area where little blood vessels, tiny blood vessels, are broken because of some force of some sort. It doesn't matter what. And blood leaks into the tissues. Now, if a person is alive and their heart is beating and they have a blood pressure, then the blood will be pushed out into the tissues by the blood pressure. If they're dead, the blood vessel still will break if there's some kind of force that's exerted on the skin, but the blood still simply leaks. It oozes out into the surrounding tissues. So it creates findings that could look like bruises that occurred when someone is alive. And sometimes this can be very difficult to make a distinction versus whether a discoloration or what appears to be a bruise happened before death or after death. It can be very difficult, but again, experienced pathologists know that discolorations, hemorrhages, or areas of bleeding in the skin certainly can be created after death with no difficulty at all. And that's why looking at the whole context of a case is very, very important, and not just simply looking at the discolorations and reaching a conclusion that they have to be bruises that occurred before death.
Could light blue bruises occur after death?
Oh yes, most certainly.
Like the ones described here?
Yes.
Is that an opinion or is it fact?
Oh, it's fact. I could probably show you in my morgue every day minor discolorations that have occurred after death. This is extremely common. It's so common that most forensic pathologists really don't think about it. We look at it, we will find these discolorations, we know the body's been moved, and then we pay attention, and then we look for other things.
Is a blue bruise always a fresh bruise?
No.
What time frame are we talking about?
It could be several days. But the only reliable feature that tells a pathologist or anyone else that a bruise is healing is when a yellow halo and green discoloration begins to develop, because that's the body's effect of breaking down and removing the blood that is leaked out into the tissues. And that can take 2 to 3 days at a minimum, sometimes longer.
But you're saying that a blue bruise could be several days old.
Oh, yes.
The bruise is described in this examination.
Yes. If they occurred before her death, they could very easily be several days old.
So they could have occurred several days before she died, and they could have sustained after death.
Absolutely.